Your Holiness, this afternoon we're going to move to consider possible biological underpinnings of meditation. And we have two presenters who are world's experts in different aspects of brain and biology. And Wolf Singer has dedicated his scientific career to understanding how the network organization of the brain and synchrony gives rise to higher mental functions. And that is the topic that he will be addressing.
His Holiness, it is a great honor for me to be here next to you. And I will do the next 25 minutes. I will try to explain to you and the audience what we believe could be one of the neuronal substrates of the conscious states that characterize meditation. And I will talk about the role of synchronous oscillatory activity in the brain, about its relation to attention and consciousness, and if time allows, also mention some implications that it may have in explaining pathologies such as schizophrenia, this disease that goes along with thought disorders and delusions and hallucinations. And if we could have the PowerPoint, because it's not up there. As you have heard this morning, there is evidence that states of meditation are associated with the synchronization of oscillatory activity in a very high frequency range in the cerebral cortex, frequency range around 40 hertz, the so-called gamma frequencies. We don't have the PowerPoint on the screen, which I would prefer. So I would like to briefly show you how these oscillations look like in terms of neuronal activity. Now, it's a pity that you can't see what His Holiness and myself can see. But that's probably enough. So what His Holiness and myself can see in the moment.
I think some arrangement. I think she should.
Yeah.
The slides should be up. Yeah.
I don't know, it's hooked up, it's projector one. Yeah, it should be. You need to do something. It worked yesterday. This is usually what happens.
This morning I think working.
It was working.
Yeah, it was working all the time. They need to switch something. So what His Holiness and myself are seeing here is neuronal activity that is taken from the cerebral cortex in the brain, and it shows that under certain conditions, when the brain is appropriately activated, there are grouped discharges of neurons, and there is an oscillatory patterning of this activity in the range of about 40 hertz. And this has been an early discovery that we made in Frankfurt about 15 years ago, and since then we follow the idea that this might be a signal that is required for the integration of distributed activity in the brain. But now it would really be good if we had the PowerPoint switched on. Now,
Still not.
we go on. His Holiness, you have everything here.
It would be helpful if the audience can see the slides.
Yeah, it would be helpful because they could read what I say, but I can just say it. This is text slides, so you won't be too embarrassed. So the question is...
I think we can wait.
We should wait?
Wait, I think. 1 minute, 1 or 2 minutes, I think.
They're working on it, Wolf.
Yeah. Well, we can continue with the text now, should we?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, it's all hooked up. It worked well yesterday, and this morning also. And it's cable number 1. No, we don't need this one. Anyway, let me explain to you in words. This is just what is written here. The question is whether there's something special about synchronized activity in the brain. And yes, there is. Synchronized activity has a much stronger impact on cells that receive this activity than temporarily uncoordinated activity. And therefore, synchronizing responses is equivalent with selecting responses for further processing. And because only synchronized responses will profit from each other in terms of becoming more effective, synchronizing responses is equivalent with the definition of relations among the neurons which are synchronously active. So it is a possibility to define relations among neuronal responses that may be distributed across the brain. So the conclusion from these considerations is that precise synchronization of neuronal activity can in principle serve as a signature of relatedness in signal processing and by virtue of this, of course, also in learning. Synchrony defines which neurons cooperate in order to convey their message jointly. Now, the question arises why the definition of relatedness among distributed neuronal responses should be such an important issue for the functioning of brains. Now it would really be helpful. What I could do is I will briefly close this computer and open it again so it will restart. Maybe this helps debug something. And explain to you why it is so important to have synchrony. Yeah? I tried this. This is not what it does. Yeah, it worked beautifully yesterday.
On the, I don't know, is it, I don't know apples, is this
I think it's not the computer.
No, that's the audio. It's not.
It's too bad. Now what we could do is I have a stick.
Oh, I'll put it on this.
Yeah. Why don't you load this on another computer? Okay, we will try to load this on the other computer. Now, the question arises, why is it at all important to have a signal of relatedness in the brain? And the hypothesis is that the importance comes from the fact that we, in our Western societies, have a wrong intuition about how the brain is organized. We here, when we ask our internal eye, our intuition, of how the brain might be organized, we have a Cartesian view. we think that somewhere in the brain there ought to be a convergence center, a singular place, where all the information comes together in order to allow for a coherent interpretation of the world. This would be the place where decisions are reached, and this is called a Mind and Life short final.
가르쳤어. 가르쳤어.
Short file.
알레.
This is really a nuisance. Huh? So this would be the place where decisions are reached, and finally this would also be the place where the self has its seat. Now, modern brain research designs a completely different picture of the organization of our brain. If we had a picture, you would now see areas of the cerebral cortex, about 100 of them, which are interconnected very, very intensively, one with the other. But there is no evidence for a convergence center or for a pyramidal hierarchical organization. These areas, they deal with very different inputs, like from the eye, from the ear, from the touch senses. And then there are areas which belong to the so-called limbic system, which attach emotional connotations to the contents of conscious experience. So there is no single place in the brain where an observer could be located, or a command structure could be implemented, or where the self could have its seat. It's a highly distributed system in which many, many functions occur simultaneously, and there is no coordinator. They self-organize. Now, in such a system, it becomes extremely important that the many neuronal responses which are generated simultaneously all the time get labeled such that it is clear at any one moment in time which neurons actually collaborate with which other neurons. We need a code that defines relations. Because of this distributed representation, or distributed organization, an object in the brain is represented by many, many thousands of neurons which are active at the same time, and they are distributed over different areas. Like if you watch a barking dog, you touch its fur, you have input from the touch sense, from the eyes, from the ears, and they will be processed in different areas of the cerebral cortex, all simultaneously, never coming together at any singular place. And even within a modality like the visual system, there are about 30 different areas in the cerebral cortex which are interested in different contents. Some are interested in texture, other in color, other in motion, other in certain aspects of shapes. And all these aspects are extracted simultaneously. Okay. It's always good to have a backup. So, this intuition is wrong with the singular center, and this is the graph that we now believe in with all these different areas. Each of these black dots corresponds to an area of the cerebral cortex, and each of these lines corresponds to a connection between those areas. And somehow, in this distributed network, emerges the representation, for example, of a barking dog with a silky fur. So there is we have to consider representations as being extremely distributed across many different neurons, which may be located in many different cortical areas. So there is no coordinator, no observer, no seat of the self. And even within a single sensory system, as I told you, within the visual system, you have all these colored areas here, which is an unfolded monkey cerebral cortex, and all the colored areas, they deal with visual information processing. Each of these areas with a different aspect of vision. So when complex pictures like this one have to be decoded, activity from many different places in the brain needs to be bound together in a meaningful way in order to give rise to the percept of one of these horses, for example. One has to bind together the right contours and segregate them from the contours of the background.
Is it a real photograph?
This is, no, this is a made-up photograph. This is a drawing. But it could happen. So, since there is no convergence center in the brain, representations of cognitive contents must consist of the coordinated activity of a very large number of neurons distributed across the cortical mantle. Now, and this is the reason why it is so important to define relations in such a distributed system. As I have already said, we need a code that defines with very high temporal precision from instance to instance, because the contents of consciousness change very rapidly, which subset of the myriads of neurons actually contributes at any one moment in time to a coherent representation. So neurons have to signal two things simultaneously. First, through their activation, they have to signal whether the feature for which they are specialized is present. And second, they have to convey the message that with whom they are actually cooperating in this very moment in order to form a coherent representation. And the proposal is, and there is a lot of evidence now, that this dynamic definition of relations, of ever-changing relations, is achieved by the synchronization of neuronal discharges, and that therefore this mechanism is likely to play a key role in the coordination and integration of distributed brain processes in general. So currently, in the scientific community, we discuss a number of roles which this synchronization could play. And I remind you, this is the synchronization that increases so dramatically when professional, let me say professional practitioners engage in meditative states. There is this simple function of perceptual grouping, so the binding together of features in order to get a coherent percept. Then there is evidence that it is used by the brain in order to focus attention on certain inputs and make them more salient, make them more effective. There is evidence that we self-generate these synchronous oscillatory activity patterns when we close our eyes and imagine something, like a visual object, and then the visual areas engage in this activity, which apparently reads out stored information. Then we know that it is very important for the integration of subsystems, like in the case of the barking dog, to bind together the sound with the touch, with the image of the dog. Then a function that gets more and more in the focus of attention is the routing of activity through this extremely complex network of the brain. A big problem in the brain is that messages need to be sent from one place to another place with high selectivity. Now you saw the connections which are so much intermingled. How is this done? And there's evidence that nature has found a way, very much like when we use a radio, to tune into a transmitter, that it puts the sender and the receiver in the same frequency, and then they can resonate and handshake, and then transmission of information becomes very selective. So it is used for routing of activity. Then it is involved in memory processes, both short-term memory, when you want to remember a telephone number or a few things for a short period of time. Oscillations occur over the particular brain areas. And then it's also used in order to inscribe long-term memories, because synchronous activity is ideally suited to change neuronal response properties on a long term. So I would like to give you a few selected examples of the involvement of synchrony in cognitive processes. An important feature is the state dependency. Brains are not always in the same state. They may be drowsy, inattentive, or they may be attentive. And here is what one sees when one records the EEG from the scalp. In an attentive state, this is cursor? Well, it doesn't matter. The brain waves have small amplitude and fairly high frequency, as you see on the left. And then when the brain gets a little bit drowsy, inattentive, then these large amplitude waves occur. And the interesting finding is that this synchronous activity, which you see on the left is this hilly histogram, you see it all very on the left, occurs only when the brain is in a highly attentive state. And it disappears completely when the brain gets drowsy and non-attentive. Even though the nerve cells continue to respond as before. They are very active, but they are no longer temporally coordinated in their activity. So attention is not so much modulating the amount of activity, but the coherence, the synchronization of the activity, which is an important issue. Then, we know that brains, when they anticipate,
So in a sense, would you say it's like in one case there is no coordination, in another context there is a coordination?
Right.
Work together.
When you become attentive, like the meditators, when they go in this attentive state, they coordinate the activity of neurons. They don't increase so much the activity, but they coordinate it very precisely. And the same happens when a brain or an animal or an organism anticipates an action or a cognitive act, when it prepares for something. And this can be seen here. Here a cat has been trained to distinguish a pattern which is presented on the screen, and then to quickly respond when the pattern changes. Now the cat knows when this will happen because there will be a buzz announcing this event. And one can then record from the brain of these animals while they perform this action. And again, look for synchrony. And what one sees is that when the cat is not attentive, when it is feeding, which you see on the right side where it's written reward, then the brain waves are slow and there is no good synchrony among the different areas. But when a sound is emitted which tells the animal, now you have to turn around, look at the pattern, now it will change and you have to react quickly, then all of a sudden the activity between the cortical areas changes dramatically. They all of a sudden become oscillating in synchrony, as you see on the left side. You see this nice sharp pattern of colored lines which indicate synchrony among cortical regions. So the cat produces this in anticipating that it needs these cortical areas engaged in a particular function. So sender and receiver, as I said, they tune in the same frequency in order to allow better handshaking. Now, there is also evidence that when something that one sees becomes consciously aware, that this goes along with a critical amount of synchronization among neurons. And this can be done or shown in a simple experiment. Here on the left, you see the sequence of events in such an experiment. One presents a noisy pattern to the subject, which has no content, then a word, in this case cat, then again one of these blurring patterns, and then after a while, one asks the subject, have you seen the word or did you not see the word? And is it the same word as the one which is shown at the end of the experiment? So there are three cases that can happen here. The subject sees this first word, consciously remembers and recognizes that it was the same. Or the subject does not consciously see the word, but still process the word and still get the task right, but does not remember having seen the word. It just guesses, but is right. So it's subconscious processing. And the third case is that it doesn't see the word and does not consciously process, does not process at all. And now one can again measure brain activity. One can again measure brain activity and look for synchronization patterns between different cortical areas. And what you see on the graph on the left side is that when subjects consciously process and are aware of what they have seen, there is a brief moment of about a fraction, 200, 300 milliseconds, very short, where remote areas in the cerebral cortex, where the electrodes are located, synchronize their activity in this high frequency range, which the meditators produce spontaneously or when they make an effort. Synchronizes very briefly, very precisely, and then it goes away again. While on the right side, the right column, subjects see the same thing, but they don't consciously process, and then there is no synchrony, or very little. So it appears as if one correlate of conscious perception where the transitory synchronization of neuronal responses in order to establish a highly coherent pattern of activity across the cerebral mantle. This seems to be one of the correlates of conscious states. We can't say much more than that. The content of consciousness apparently is distributed over many areas, is temporarily assembled through coherence, and cannot be further reduced into a location. It is a distributed dynamical pattern. Difficult to imagine, but that is what it seems to be. And then at the very end, I would like to show you possible consequences on pathology and maybe also some issues that might be relevant to therapy. There is a simple task that we can perform very easily. If one shows a subject a pattern briefly, and then has this pattern, make this pattern disappear, and then after a while show it again and ask the subject, have you already seen this pattern, or is it a new one? In this case, one has to engage short-term memory, one has to remember what it was and then compare. And this, performing this task again goes along with the synchronization of activity in the prefrontal region of the brain here and in the parietal region. It requires attention and is a conscious process. Now, we know that in schizophrenic patients who have thought disorders and hallucinations and difficulties in arranging the parallel processes in their brains, they have difficulties with this task. And the question was, is this also going along with a disturbance of this correlated activity? Maybe they have difficulties in coordinating the activity, and here is the outcome. One can measure the activity in these brain regions which are relevant for this task. And here you see...
Will there also be a difference in terms of the speed at which the synchronization takes place?
Yeah, you will see that they have difficulties in producing these waves and in synchronizing them. And they also perform the task much worse than control subjects. So what you see on this slide here is when these are the cortical areas in color, which become active during this task. It's again a distributed network. And then one can measure the activity in one of these places, and the blue line, the blue curve, corresponds to the performance of normal subjects. When they see the target, they have to encode it, which is the first peak. And when they recall, they have to compare the target with the test picture, and then they also activate again. And as one makes the task more and more difficult, like here from load 1 to load 2 to load 3, normal subjects activate more and more and more. But the patients, which are shown in red, don't do this. They can't increase their activation for some unknown reason, unfortunately, and they also perform much less well. And the interesting point that I wanted to get at is this slide here. Here we measured again the oscillatory brain potentials and determined their synchrony. And we did this during the moment when they see the picture for the first time and have to encode it, to remember it. And normal subjects, as you see in the cross here, when this happens, they produce a lot of activity, which is shown here in brighter colors, red and yellow, in this high-frequency oscillatory gamma range, like 40 hertz. And this is shown here by the green line. Control subjects increase their activity at around the time of encoding. But schizophrenic patients don't do it. They can't increase.
Did never so sorry. Ale. Yeah.
And they also have difficulties, and I have not shown the slide here, I didn't bring it with me, to coordinate by synchronization activity in different cortical areas. So maybe this is one of the reasons why they have difficulties in coordinating their thoughts and in being able to coherently organize their behavior. So to conclude, and this is my last slide, if it is true that synchronization of these high-frequency rhythms serves to coordinate the many distributed processes in the brain, then a method like mental training meditation that enhances this synchronization should have profound effects on brain functions. Now, to find out what these effects are will be the goal of the future research. Not all of them may be beneficial. It may sometimes be not a good thing to bring things together which should stay separated. But certainly, it will be highly effective in generating states of consciousness that differ from those that we normally have when we act in a dissociated way in our environment. And so I think there are two lines of research coming together which have been largely segregated in the past. And I'm particularly grateful to be here and learn a lot from these conversations. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I took too much time.
Yeah.
Thank you for making this possible. Now, during this conference, there will be a lot of experts talking about how to live a life in balance. Unfortunately, I have no idea how to do that. But what I am an expert at is what happens if you don't do that. In that, in that I study the effects of stress on the body.
Gyönthal bir keç burada.
it's very important actually to see the negative side.
Good. Well, I am a guinea
Then
pig
there
for
will be
that.
attempt to face that.
What to
Otherwise,
avoid.
normal.
Good. Now, to make sense of this, we have to think about a very unique thing that humans do, and a thing that humans do which is not at all unique. Now, anthropologists are always interested in what is it that makes humans different from other animals. And what we now know is that humans are the species that invented microwaves, and humans invented ballroom dancing, and humans invented toilet training.
What was the third one? Toilet training. And then
But the thing that humans have invented more than anything is adventitious suffering. The ability to feel pain for what was, the pain and suffering of what will be, of what could be, of what someone else experiences. All of these are very unique about humans, but the thing that unfortunately is not unique about humans is what our bodies do when we are feeling adventitious suffering. Because the central concept in all of the study of stress is if you are a zebra and a lion has leapt out and ripped your stomach open, and you are in pain, and you are running for your life, the things you do with your body then are wonderful, are exactly what you want to have happen in order to survive. But if you are a human suffering from adventitious pain, the key thing is your body does the exact same thing. And when it does that, and if it does that for a long time, disease will arise.
No.
And in a sense, the reason why we as a species get so many diseases related to stress is we're too smart, and we have the ability to invent psychological stress. Now, in understanding what psychological stress is, there is by now a lot of research showing what is involved in this. And before talking about it, these are summaries of studies, classic studies done in the 1960s, making use of animals. And I believe the scientists who did that work thought very hard to balance the good that would come from it with the pain. But what is shown in a study like this in the top line is you take a laboratory rat. Every now and then you give it a very small shock. With enough of them, the animal will develop a stomach ulcer. It will develop a disease sensitive to stress. Now, many people know, in fact, from the Nobel Prize last month, that stomach ulcers involve a bacteria, but in addition, you both need to have the bacteria and stress, a stressful lifestyle. What stress does is make it difficult for the stomach to repair the beginnings of an ulcer. So here we have a rat who is getting enough stress that it gets an ulcer. In the second line, we see a rat who is getting the exact same shocks. Its reality is exactly the same. But this rat, every time it gets a shock, can go over to the other side of the cage where there is another rat, and it will bite it. And the rat does not get an ulcer.
구조도 있어진 거죠.
당부디 공치고체 엘렉트릭 쇼크. 이거디 쇼크제가 지금 지금 쇼크제가 근데 반항은 도서요. 그들이 진신다 줘서 봐. 진신다들 코 소리를 해서 봐. 소리를 지금 등에 쉐어셔서 그렇지. 네. 그 알츠하이머가 말했어.
그거 expression.
And thus we see that rats are close relatives of humans. What we see...
So as soon as they're saying it, is it like the rat has then a chance to express the pain? Or?
Exactly. What we say in my business is it avoids getting an ulcer by giving an ulcer. What we see in the third line, this time the rat getting the shock, there is a bar of wood that it can chew on with its teeth, and it does not get an ulcer. Again, a way for it to come out. In the next line, the rat is getting the same shocks, but just before each shock, a light comes on, warning it. And when you get information like that, telling you when is it going to come, how bad is it going to be, and how long will it last?
So it's
You
like
don't-
preparing the rat.
Exactly. In the next version, the rat has been trained to press a lever. By pressing a lever, it does not get shocks. Today, the lever is there, but it is disconnected. It is not doing anything. But the rat sits there hitting the lever. Hitting the lever does nothing, but the rat does not get an ulcer. It feels a sense of control. To jump to the last line, you take a rat, and now in the cage is another rat that it knows and it likes, and they sit together and they groom each other, and it does not get an ulcer. What we see then are the building blocks of psychological stress are if you have no way to release your frustration, if you feel like there is no control, no predictability, if you interpret the event as meaning life is getting worse, and if you have no one to cry on their shoulder. And this is what makes stress stressful when you deal with adventitious suffering. What we now know is how the body responds to this. And to make sense of this, again, we need to see what the body does if you are a zebra running away from a lion, and that's on the left. The first thing you need is energy. Energy not in your fat cells for some project next spring, but energy right now to go to your muscles as you run. So that is the first thing your body does. Next, you want to deliver that energy to your muscles as quickly as possible. Your heart beats more quickly, your blood pressure goes up. All this logic, if you can get the energy to your muscles in 2 seconds instead of 3, you are more likely to survive. Now, the next things you do during stress make a great deal of sense also. You turn off all sorts of long-term building projects in the body. This is no time to start renovating your liver. Do it some other time. Or
stress 기디 쇼크부 요백갑데 아니야 지난 수부기 교육부 지 가서도 최대한 괜찮은 내가 지거든요 여러분 근데 리버 좀 소고야 돼 디기를 좀 function 너무 샷다운 지그래서 그 가도도 잘아요 진짜.
Or you are running for your life and the lion is one step behind you. This is not a good time to ovulate.
그냥 보자 또 간다 차고제비 쇼게 네 쿠라데 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 마스터 다zen 잡에 가면 다zen 맞아버려도 네 간다 보고 차에 내가 지쇼 액치 리리스 치고 봐 뒤좀 말해서.
So during stress, you stop digestion, you stop growth, you stop the repair of your body, you stop reproduction, you stop your immune system. The logic being, do it tonight if you're still alive tonight. Also, you make changes, the final line, you make changes in your brain, which I'll talk about more in a moment. So all of this is wonderful for a zebra running for its life, because this is a way for its body to deal with pain. What we see on the right is what humans do with their bodies to deal with suffering when you do the same exact thing with your body for days and months and years because of psychological suffering. In the first line, if you always mobilize energy, your body never stores it. Your muscles become weak. You are more likely to get this disease, diabetes, which has now become a disaster for the planet. At the level of the heart, if you increase your blood pressure running away from a lion, that's a good thing. If you increase your blood pressure because of a traffic jam, and you do that enough, you will have heart disease, your blood vessels will get atherosclerosis, damage there. If you constantly shut down the digestive system, you are more at risk for an ulcer. Among children, there is a terrible, strange disease of children who are under so much psychological stress that their bodies stop growing. It is called stress dwarfism or psychogenic dwarfism. At another realm, if you are under lots of stress and you are a female mammal, your reproductive cycles become long, they will stop altogether. If you are a male, your testosterone levels will go down, there will be problems with erections. What you also
그래도 보고 차에 두주죠 봐. 뒤에 장군데 다산자에 두주 장제 보고 차에 고를 왔다. 개발이나 그냥 되게 네거든요면다. 나 자마랑도 되게
I should add that never in my life have I thought I would be discussing erections here with you. But I digress. What you then find with the immune system, if you are always under stress, your immune system will be so suppressed that you are more vulnerable to infectious disease. And this is this whole new field, psychoneuroimmunology, the notion that your brain can affect how your body deals with disease. So before moving to the last line, what we see here are two sides of a story. If you are going to be stressed like a normal mammal, you must do the things on the left side of that chart, or you will be dead in 1 minute. But if you are stressed like a human,
the stress symptoms
but if you are stressed like a human with chronic psychological stress, on the right, many diseases will emerge. Now, I'd like briefly to focus on the good side, the short-term effects of stress, and the long-term effects, how they affect the brain, because that seems particularly interesting. For a short time during stress, maybe for 1 to 2 hours, stress does wonderful things for the brain. There's more oxygen and glucose delivered to the brain. There is a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is involved in memory, and the hippocampus works better when you are stressed for only a little while. There is a brain chemical called dopamine, which has something to do with pleasure, and your brain releases more dopamine early on during stress, and it feels wonderful, and your brain works better. What, of course, will be the other side of this is what happens when stress has gone on for too long, for 4 hours, for 4 years, and everything is the opposite. There is less energy delivered to your brain. In the hippocampus, those brain cells, those neurons, do not function as well. Neurons have long processes, long cables that they use to talk to other neurons. During stress, the processes will shrivel away. As we heard before, the brain makes new neurons in the hippocampus, and when there is stress, the brain no longer makes new neurons. Also, the thing that my laboratory studies, with enough stress, neurons will actually die. In addition, that same brain chemical dopamine, which is involved in pleasure, with a lot of stress, there's no dopamine left in the brain. There is no pleasure. And that has something to do with depression. Then there is a part of the brain called the amygdala, which is involved in fear and anxiety. And amazingly, stress makes the amygdala work better. The neurons there grow new connections. The area gets bigger, and we are more trapped by fear. Finally, the part of the brain that Richie was talking about, the frontal cortex, which helps you to make decisions and to control your emotions, the frontal cortex does not work well during chronic stress, and its neurons also will shrivel away. So what we see here are some extremely potentially damaging things that can happen in the brain with chronic stress. Now, the easy thing to say would be, aha, we must have no stress in our life. But that is nonsense, because what we saw from the left side of that chart is for a short period, stress does wonderful things for the brain. And we love it. It makes us feel good. We will pay money to be on a roller coaster and to be terrified. So the question becomes, when is stress a good thing? And we call good stress stimulation. When there is a challenge, when there is something to try to overcome. What is it that makes stress stimulatory?
We're just wondering what would be the most equivalent Tibetan term for stress.
How would you define it? Would you make it two sorts, physical and mental, or would you have one generic? We need some unpacking here because it doesn't translate.
Okay. Short-term stress can be physical, can be mental. The main thing is it does not go on for too long. It does not go on for too long, and it is not too large. It is not by chance that a roller coaster ride is 3 minutes long and not 3 weeks long. Psychologically, the thing about stimulation is we think it is a challenge, but we are not helpless. We may be able to overcome this challenge. And the way dopamine works is very interesting in that way. This morning, Richie talked about how in the United States we are guaranteed happiness. What I suspect makes more sense for our brains is that we are guaranteed the pursuit of happiness. And it turns out dopamine is not released in the brain when you get a reward. Dopamine is released when you think you are going soon to get a reward. It is about anticipation. And thus, anticipation becomes pleasure for the brain itself.
도파민 있다는 chemical process 지어로 디기 충격하는 김낭 충격을 release 시거래서 디페나 자라로 뭐를 되고요나 그 라비 슈글이야 도파민 release 시거래서 그 처음에가야 따라마라.
A wonderful study looked at this. Where a monkey is trained to press a lever, and then it will get a reward. Now, instead, it presses the lever, but it will get the reward only half of the time. And what you see is after it presses the lever and it is waiting to see, will I get the reward, its dopamine levels go the highest you will ever see in the brain of a monkey. In other words, as soon as you introduce the idea of maybe, it is so much more rewarding. If you are absolutely certain, it's boring. If there's no chance, you are helpless and depressed. 50% is right at the point where challenge is there, but it does not suffocate you. And that is when you see the greatest release of dopamine in the brain. But that seems strange, because earlier I was saying that a lack of control is very stressful. Here, a lack of control feels wonderful, and your dopamine goes up. What's the difference? And what the research shows is if the lack of control occurs in a setting that you feel is malevolent, is threatening, lack of control is a terrible stressor. If the lack of control occurs in a setting that you feel is benign, is in the context of a good, safe world, lack of control feels wonderful. And of course, one of the great challenges then is to understand how can we make settings that feel threatening instead become ones that are benign. What that raises is the last point. What that raises is the final point, is to understand why some of us deal better with stress than others, why what is stressful for one of us is stimulation for the other. Now, stress has been part of medicine for about 70 years, and it has taken about 69 years to convince medicine to pay attention to it. What is the big challenge from now on is to understand why we differ from one person to the next. Because that will teach us how to turn adventitious suffering into stimulation.
스트레스 요에 계속 그러지. 아니 자연이야. 준비해야 좋대요. 고급라 그러었어.
So thank you for helping to teach the world that.
Before we begin the discussion, let me just mention the issue of asking questions from the audience. I apologize for this morning's session. We're still trying to coordinate all of this, but if you have questions, please write them down and pass them to the center aisle. And can I ask Ben Shapiro and Dan Goldman to please stand? These are two Mind and Life board members. There's Ben. I don't see Dan. Danny, you have to come down. So Dan and Ben will assemble the questions and pass them to the stage, and we will be sure to leave time to take your questions, and we'll devote a chunk of time during this session. So please feel free to write them and pass them to the center. And you know who Ben is, and Dan will come down at some point. Okay. To begin the discussion, I thought it would be useful to go back to a point that Wolf made. And Wolf's research, as one of his slides that we did see indicates, that there's no, what neuroscientists have called convergence zone in the brain, where that is the seat of emotion or consciousness or the self, but rather these complex functions, these complex psychological functions, appear to arise as a function of the coordinated activity of many brain regions. And I wonder if, Your Holiness, you can comment on the extent to which Buddhist intuitions about the mind are similar or different from the intuitions that are beginning to emerge from modern neuroscience that suggest that that there is this important coordination and that there's no single center for the self or for other psychological processes.
지난도 되게 안 되게 좋은데 왕시다 똑바 다지다는 건 저다 시바스 수지 시야 되거 봐 저다 시베 때 시바 지라고 때 패지다 레베 지라고 패지 샤나 마대요 소리 tako 레벤네 소소소리야 그래 랭게 조로지 여체야 tako 통되고 그러다 이제 지용보다 지금 유지비 차와치야로 다는 신 명소 차와차디디 고직질 되는 거 해지 처음에는 디디셰디 저는 로를 차대로 와 셀레바 소스 레자 지라고 지기 소스 개전을 여베이는 레바 직견샤나 레바 직구디 처치하신 거 당군에 계속 있는 가오로 저는 미기시베 미공부 견샤나 나시베 디소시도 와보다
In some ways, the understanding that is emerging in neuroscience about how cognitive functions arise seems to have some similarities with the Buddhist intuition, where there is no supposition of a central authority, a one thing that is responsible for the cognitive or the mental activity. There is, however, a distinction made in Buddhism between sensory experiences on the one hand and mental level of experiences such as thoughts and emotions on the other. Now, with relation to the sensory experiences, there is a much closer correspondence to sensory organs. So, for example, if you have defective eye organ, then the visual experience cannot be taken over by any other sensory modalities. So in that sense, there is a very intimate connection between the sensory faculty and the mental experience. However, in the domain of mental experience, such as thoughts and emotion, the situation is more complex. So if the idea in neuroscience is that for each of these different thoughts related to a particular content or particular experience, such as whether it is a cognitive activity or an emotional activity or whatever it is, if the understanding is that they are related to a very specialized, localized part of the brain, then that would be contrary to the Buddhist intuition, where there is an understanding that although there might be specific part of the brain that may be related more strongly with a particular type of activity, but generally they would be, yes.
낭주의 흉내 즉 레벨 남샤디 식매와 다 안된 제시디 레벨 제시로 배 몽구 덤베토네 용구여데 딘제시디 제베 이나 나다 시바 다베시디 이루조로 시베이네 와다디 나도 그래 죽은 데만 타고 나중에 생각했을 거라고 죽은 데만 타면 남식이 뒤에서 네가 그러시고 이금
이왕 그래서 이게 시바
다긴 이왕 시고로 다디 sometimes 또 하다디 샘스kim도 와다 이왕 쓴다 죽은 데만 타고 쓸 수 있지만 또 샘스kim도 와다 안당한 저 샤인도 전에 그래서 미기 시발로 소비시도 제 거거라 공부 수주식다 이해되지 다 이왕 쓰는데 패지 조조 레벨이 되는 거 소리 저도 와다 그러다 그래서 딱고 이로 치다 낭제 먹고 치다도 낭제 먹고 사 연구를 돼 이제 지금부터 이로고 패지다 리나 이 샤카고 살이샤 갤시리 사버다 가라도 리서치가 주제 그래서 고두적으로 배개시 버리자 그래서 다들 계셔야 돼 거라 거 이루직 독시하면은 사고 레벨 치라고 지 레벨 치라고 지 차 치고소소면 비체 덤네 지하지 럼노 롤 찻대도 그래서 낭바도 튠샤를 쓰습니다 그래서 레벨 자식과
The problem is that in Buddhist epistemology or psychology, there is no discussion of the role of brain as such, whether it is emotions or cognitive activity. So,
although in tantric text or tantric system, so the work of nerve system, although mentioned, in that day. 레벨 거는 쉬쉬게 말이에요.
대회 때인데 이게 샤고.
레벨 쉬쉬게 말어.
So even in the Vajrayana text, the concept of brain as having a central role in the cognitive activity is really not there. But the point His Holiness was trying to make is that the idea that many of the cognitive functions, such as experience of emotions and fear and so on, and including the cognitive activity, which the Buddhist would refer to as belonging to the domain of mental experience, the idea that they are kind of expressions of a much greater coordination of different regions of the brain seems to be more intuitively appealing than the idea that each specific function of the mind can be very directly correlated to a specific localization of the brain.
Do you want to comment on it?
Yeah, I find it interesting that our Western philosophies and civilizations have come to a completely different conclusion. I mean, the Cartesian view couldn't be much more different from this view than one can imagine. And the question is why has this developed that way? And I think at lunchtime we had a discussion on this question, and one of the suggestions was that because we have developed Western analytical science that was dominated over centuries by linear models, machines, clockworks that work in a highly deterministic way, like La Métrie's idea of a brain that functions like a complex clock. if one assumes that these are the processes going on in our brain, then a necessary conclusion is, because we experience our brains as creative, open towards the future, intentional, and since a linear system that works like a clockwork has none of these properties, we sort of are forced to postulate a mover, because otherwise we can't explain why these brains do what they do, be creative, be open into the future, and have intentions. And so I think it is our rooting in this mechanistic interpretation of the world that has been the basis of classical physics, has been since the Illumination times dominating our way of thinking, that the Cartesian interpretation was the only possibility to reconcile this mechanistic view with what we observe.
초진 때는 얌좀 쉬우려서 그래서 누조베 기타단다 베트가 가르쳐서 누조베 따단데 딱구나 삼단데 찾는데 흉도는 개박하면서 집에는 슬라벤의 폐지를 흉라랭 메로스 그래서 누조리아 체리 흉좀 다제 친구분의 좀 보지 미신도 없이 삼단
어디래 그냥 쉐바스야리 다 지금 레벨 누구지가 안 삼단 거로
말하는 거는 세들이 미신 없이 삼단 뭐 인자스 나 쉐벌 따는 거라 the machine double jitation with Catania Mashana. Central authority which Catania Mashana could take 2 millions and the digit says that could someone do some jobs with chick 10 years. The data
That didn't mention that. I don't know. I don't say. Tell the Shivas Luzane and the Ganzulo child Luzane. 머시다 딱진 숙진지든가 연용구요래. 그래서 이내 자와다 세고 세리기다 정신전지기 그런 누버 수두식 시가 없다. 나 안다 대시르잖아요. 그 레벨에다 누버 직장장서보다 시가 없다. 근데 그 구두시하스는 와.
In a way, this question touches on perhaps more philosophical and metaphysical level, which may not be that relevant to the discussion here. But for example, from the Buddhist point of view, when you think about cognition,
I think not only Buddhist, but I think according ancient
Indian thought, from the perspective of ancient Indian thought, when we think about the experience of consciousness or various aspects of consciousness, such as cognition, emotions, and so on. The primary characteristic that comes to mind is this experiential nature, quality of experience. Whereas in the context of a neuroscience discussion, then generally all functions of the mind are really seen as functions of the brain. So here are 2 different kind of languages. So maybe that, your question touches on this deeper metaphysical issue.
That's soul the chujog than tiny soul says shit. That deed that did not as already. Anyone has a law, Menzil Hengili, Nasa as wrong, a lot of sugar. That didn't initiate in the advisors for the controller to you go to Sapolsky. They are Cabachi Pashi Shechi. They never know Sanjay and the Chevy. The Dam is Omara. Pumble attention, but Yamari says Diana Pumble, Devil round, Rangapin, dating Diamond Swarmado. Diamond Swarma. Diamond controller to your. The controller of Quires Lona, and Yamon Sigurado.
So, and I'm talking about the cultural influences. Part of the influence is perhaps also coming from the influence of religious thinking in the past on philosophy. So the notion of soul is prevalent in a culture. And then, on that basis also, when you relate to one's own personal experience on a day-to-day life, we all experience a sense of selfhood. I'm doing this for myself, I see you, and so on. So the sense of selfhood is very instinctual, we all possess it. And then when we try to identify what that sense of selfhood really refers to, what's the content of that, then people tend to assume that
장도 롤텐질이야. 나가가서 지금 라왕으로 지금 나지 그 증기에도지다 딜로 되게 좀은 신지가 나랑 매번 다음에 쉽게 되고 그 녀도 속에 봤다 고친지로 올라 인도잖아요. 다음에 보다 쉽게 되고.
So, and it's also our kind of intuitive sense, this natural sense of selfhood, that also assumes that this self, no matter how difficult it may be to pinpoint what it is or where it is, we tend to assume that this is the core of our being. This is the central organizing principle. This is the very principle of one's existence. However, in Buddhism, there is a lot of discussions on how this mode of conceiving oneself is misfounded. There is no such eternal abiding principle that is true me or true self. And the idea that, over and above the physical and the mental elements that constitute our experience, the idea that over and above this, there is something called soul or self is misguided. And this is what the Buddhists mean when the Buddhism talk about negation of selfhood or absence of selfhood.
저는 the scientific 전에 다 자유잖아요. 근데 시바 즉 소로 즉다 지금 다세 조조서 매듭되기 가서 그래. 다세야 돼. 그 풍불을 때네 시리열에 풍불샘내 여고 풍불샘내 소리다 풍불 때네 다고 열에 이내 풍불나네 매듭을 두질라 안 거지 되시게 된 거다.
So for the Buddhists, the neuroscientific explanation of how, despite all the effort, that you cannot find any identifiable convergence point for self or soul within the complex network of neurons on the brain, is in a way a compelling reason for the Buddhists to reinforce their
reconfirmation about selfless.
To us it feels very disturbing. But
Esther, do you have a point?
I wanted to take off on your question, Your Holiness, about the good stress, bad stress. To take off a little bit.
Can we turn on her mic?
On? Thanks. Your Holiness, question.
I think you need, yeah.
Oh.
Thank you. Your Holiness questioned Robert Sapolsky's concept of good stress, bad stress, and whether, and I'd like to try to put that into a more explicit terms and pose the question as to whether meditation actually moves you along the stress curve. There is what we call an inverted U-shaped curve of the stress response. So if you imagine an upside down U, and you start on the left-hand side, that's when you're totally relaxed. You're almost asleep, you're dozing, you are not at peak performance, you're not performing at all. Your stress response, the brain centers and the hormones that, the brain hormones that Robert Sapolsky talked about, have to start pumping out to get you to the top of that U-shaped curve to be at peak performance. So for example, Wolf, when his PowerPoint was not working, that really made him go to peak performance because he was a little stressed. But had he gotten too stressed, his performance would fail. And that's when you freeze and you can't perform. And the question that I have from everything I've heard this morning and reading your very thought-provoking most recent book is it doesn't seem that meditation puts you into that relaxed state. It seems that it increases your focused attention and it moves you to the top of that U-shaped curve. And so maybe what it's really doing is modulating your stress response, putting the stress response at an optimal point. And then one last thing, the parts of the brain that are important in getting you to that peak performance, the locus coeruleus starts, the nerve cells in that part of the brain start firing optimally, not too much, not too little, but just right when you're at peak performance. And I've heard over and over again that when you're meditating in the way that you do, you have focused attention. So I wonder if that is really one of the places that meditation is affecting. I don't expect you to answer the question about the locus coeruleus, but is this part of what is happening with meditation?
No. The stress that you labor chat and you His Holiness would like to apologize to you. It may be boring to you while, I'm translating to His Holiness.
Okay, if you look through all these. Okay,
Stress not away.
Stress members and stress response and it
네, 멋있네. 나도 이 잡지 도양자 이제 결혼 없었지. 그런 쓰는 거 신에도 고마래. 재미성 하나 때문에 디카가서.
Some forms of meditations are very difficult, actually. One of a close friend, His Holiness was saying that one of his close friends was a very good meditator.
Very good one. Very good one.
And he made an attempt to cultivate the single-pointedness of mind, focused upon his own mind. And he had an experience of spending a few years in a prison in China, Chinese prison. So he told His Holiness that actually that was harder than being a prisoner. Because the point is that he had to be constantly aware and attentive without losing his attention even for a moment. So this constant vigilance was required.
다대 Matthieu 심디 Matthieu 심수 균네 딴도 대화시 두고 인생이 진짜게 미용의 현실이다 팀 도단데 디션 디용을 사지 균제근제 된중 로리야 야고지 샤하니 다지 두고 그저 가신 트로신도 다 제대로 봐도 당도라면 뭐 쉽지도 않아.
So
그저 차박샤요. 그 커도 지셔셔 있는 부신주를 지금 검증을 해 있는 그러죠.
So one factor that needs to be taken into account is the intensity of the motivation of the meditators, the quality of the motivation of the meditators. Because in the case of traditional Buddhist context, the meditators are highly motivated individuals who have a sense of deep appreciation of the framework of the Buddhist path, and also understanding of the cause and effects of if I do this, this will happen. If I do this, this will happen. And there is also a deep recognition that the fulfillment of one's aspiration for seeking happiness really lies in the transformation of one's undisciplined state to a more disciplined state of mind. So these are individuals who takes into account all of these facts. And then when they engage in meditation, they have a tremendous sense of dedication, a sense of joy, and also a very strong motivation.
His Holiness was saying, is this going to turn on? His Holiness is saying that in the Buddhist context, that when one meditates within a context, it's called the Ji Lamde. First of all, getting the lay of the land, what is the nature of reality that we're presented with in the first place? what's going on. And then a clear, as much as one can, a clear sense of what is the nature of the path that one is setting out on, what is the nature of the culmination of the path, or the fruition, develops a strong aspiration to achieve a lasting sense of well-being. And with that orientation, now kind of having your engine warmed up, then you go into meditation, and you can do so with a sustained enthusiasm. So the context is extremely important. But the final point he made was, if you just take a child and say, okay, start meditating, you're not going to get much out of that. If you just, with no context at all, just say meditate. There's no context for it, so no incentive, no inspiration.
되게 안 돼. 아, 스트레스 도와주네. 레벨런이지. 대념적인 것을 시작하고. 제가 아주 신장사도 저러지 아니나 매나. 안도 신장한데 차 토비 신장 시고 말다. 나도 다들 내거는 거래지 사분지 여러 개 시고. 무슨 내용이 뒤로 저는 매나 좀 찬스 있었나.
When you made the comment that in small doses, stress can actually raise the dopamine levels, which we assume corresponds in the rat, to a heightened sense of well-being or happiness, pleasure. His Holiness is simply pondering whether there might be an analog in Buddhist meditation, specifically in one genre of meditation, of training
Buddhist
it's not even samadhi. For the training of attention, which is not uniquely Buddhist, but in the training of single-pointed attention or samadhi, as one does so, incrementally along the path of developing attention, a quality arises that is called, it's translated in various ways as suppleness, as a malleability, a plasticity of attention, but it's often conjoined with a sense of well-being, kind of like something almost perhaps even euphoric. Yeah, it could be actually a bliss, but it's together with a suppleness, a malleability of actually the body and mind. It can go dual, and it happens in a very strong flush when you achieve a high state of samadhi, but even incrementally along the path, there are many kind of surges of this type of malleability together with the kind of bliss that goes along with it. So it looks like possibly an interesting area of research to see whether this, what you've researched from the neurophysiological perspective, might have a correlate in the contemplative research, one could say, in training attention, and some of the unexpected events or derivatives that come out of such attentional training.
Matthieu, did you?
It's just more idea about the difference between the response that's needed to save one's life or mobilization. Whether that, because stress has always a negative connotation in one way. So why not we have the idea of... sorry.
Can we get Matthew's mic on? Thank you.
Hello? Stress? No, not yet.
Okay, I think it's on now.
I think
it's okay now.
Yes, it's on.
It's on now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
No.
Sorry, so another one. We come back. Oh, now it's coming. So stress usually has a sort of negative connotation. So in the terms of someone who's immediately try to save his or her life, maybe it's more an idea of immediate responsiveness, mobilization, very sharp faculties, some of the positive aspect. Stress has this idea of the perpetuating anxiety to rumination or hopes and fears and expectations. And so in that sense, the paradox that you were mentioning about heightened state of attention in meditation, combined with a very serene and relaxed state of mind, is precisely because that positive aspect of alertness, vivacity, being in the present moment, being aware in a kind of open space, doesn't necessarily go together with a lot of hopes and fear and anxiety about this. So it's a very lucid state of mind combined with some kind of serenity or an aspect of which is free from this rumination or expectations. So you could understand how focused attention, for instance, could be a very alert state and have the qualities of responsiveness and alertness without having the negative aspect of what we usually call stress.
That taps into a very sort of classic feature of what people think about with endocrinology, with stress hormones. Okay, you secrete stress hormones when there's stress, And when there isn't stress, you don't secrete them, or you secrete just a little bit, you are at baseline. And a long-standing tradition in the field was to consider baseline to be extremely boring. Baseline is the absence of stress. And what's clear instead is that baseline is a very active, focused, metaphorically muscular process of preparation for stress. The jargon used in the field is it permits permissive effects, allowing the stress response to be as optimal as possible. So that's a wonderful endocrine analog of the notion that meditation, a state of peace, is not the absence of challenge, is not the absence of alertness and energetic expenditure. It's, if anything, a focusing of it in preparation. It absolutely matches the endocrine picture.
Alan, did you have a comment, and then we'll...
I have a question for Robert with a preface, and that is in Buddhist ethics, if one feels an impetus or a desire to speak in a very injurious way, perhaps in a very abusive way, or somebody has been insulting, or something one has found very offensive, and one wants to speak very abusively, harshly, or perhaps even physically retaliate. In Buddhist ethics, when the mind is overcome by such a distortion, mental affliction, Buddhist ethics says, restrain. Now's not the time to act. Don't act when your mind is very clouded by mental affliction. Let it pass, and then act when the mind is more balanced. But we do have your rats, and when they get a shock, assuming that we all don't want to get ulcers, they get less ulcers when they get shocked, when they find something very offensive, like getting a shock, they get relief by biting another rat, or at least gnawing on a piece of wood. And so I'm wondering, what are the implications for human beings when we are shocked by very disagreeable circumstances? From a neurobiological perspective, would it be good for us to go bite somebody, or at least chew on a piece of wood, or are there alternative strategies for us not to internalize the distress, get ulcers, make ourselves perhaps mentally or physically ill? So how do you see the interface between these two perspectives?
Well, you tap into one of the most depressing features of us as a mammal, which is across all sorts of species, the greatest way to reduce the stress response is to take it out on someone smaller and weaker. It is...
Stress response
We see this in a rat. We see this in studies of non-human primates. Among baboons, for example, 50% of aggression is displacement aggression onto a third party, an innocent bystander. A male loses a fight, chases a subadult male, who bites a juvenile, who chases an adult female, who slaps an infant. And almost everyone feels better afterward. And I think among humans, the equivalent is during times of economic stress, the rates of child abuse increase, the rates of spousal abuse increase. One of the biggest challenges in understanding us as organisms that deal with challenges of balance is how we can reattain balance in the least damaging, least selfish way. And we are fighting biology on that one. It's a challenge with maybe a 50% likelihood of success, but it's not a challenge with a 1% likelihood. But as mammals, it is an uphill battle. It's a very reliable way to make someone feel better.
Robert, just to follow up on that, do you think that our capacity as humans for regulating emotion and attention, which is really to a large extent what the kind of mental training that we've seen featured here does, and the brain systems that might support that, do you think that confers some potentially unique opportunities for humans as a species to be able to regulate these characteristics in ways which may be different than other species?
Yes, and I think that's what the justification is for all of us sitting here today. I mean, when you presented a model of what meditation does is strengthen the ability of the frontal cortex to regulate emotion.
Well, this started with the faculty of the mind looking at itself, and that's when one of the particularity, instead of acting instinctively upon the provocation or the sensation, you have the faculty to let the mind look at itself and let that powerful emotion to dissolve. So that seems quite unique.
I think the use of the word instinctive is very important there, in that when you study, psychologists are very interested in moral development in children, and there's all sorts of stages you can reach, and it turns out the stage you reach has virtually no predictability over who will do the frightening, difficult moral act as an adult. Reaching a very rarefied stage may determine what sort of university you get tenure at in your philosophy department, but it has very little predictability over who actually steps out of the crowd and does the right thing. And what the studies show instead is people who were brought up in a setting where it is just emphasized over and over and over during childhood, this is what you do, this is what you do, this is what you do, that it becomes automatic. Before, it was not a joke for me to talk about humans as inventing toilet training. We don't sit there as 30-year-olds and say, well, what would be the consequences if I did not listen to my toilet training lessons right now? It has become completely internalized. And I've been struck when you see, say, a news story of a person who does an extraordinary thing, the person who jumped in the river to save the child. And they interview the person afterward, and they never talk about, well, I thought through what would happen if we had the sort of society where people didn't do that for each other. What they always say is, before I knew it, I was in the river. It had become as automatic, it had become as not instinctual, but as ingrained of a pathway. And in a sense, the more that just becomes our imperative, I think the more we can overcome, in a sense, our limbic systems.
I would like to briefly come back to the issue of meditation. We have learned this morning that it is a state that is far away from relaxation. We have seen that the electrographic responses associated with it is a state of high attention. It's a strong internal activation of the brain. And it just strikes me that this should always be associated with positive rather than negative connotations. This would suggest that the brain, in its default mode, runs into positive states, which is surprising because we know that the brain has two systems like yin-yang, which are responsible for the positive emotions, for the negative emotions. And somehow, everything that I have heard so far about the contents of meditative states and my own personal experience is that it is always at the pleasant side. How? Why is that so? Why is it not happening, or is it happening that you get into a meditative state that gets you close to a panic attack, for example, because you happen to activate the wrong centers in your brain? Why is it always going towards the positive side? And is it, or is it not?
Well, it's encouraging, in fact. But, intuitively, when we become extremely angry and do something hurtful to others, a few hours later, intuitively you say, I was out of myself. I was no more myself. There's this kind of intuition that is, although there's a potential for that, is a kind of deviation. Similarly, if you do a very disinterested and spontaneous act of love or loving kindness or generosity. Somehow you feel this is something that is more attuned to your deeper nature. This is intuitive feeling. So in that sense, the undisturbed state of being should be more towards this positive quality rather than the deviation that occurs through mental constructions towards obsession and hatred and so forth. And this oneness is always saying that this is what rests the idea that deep within compassion and altruistic love is more attuned to our true nature than the afflictive emotion that sometimes emerge out of our mental constructs.
So that was in part what I was trying to address in my earlier point about the inverted U-shaped curve. But my take-home message from what I've heard about meditation up until this point is not that it's a positive state, but it's an active state. I mean, it's a very active and in some cases very difficult state to achieve. And maybe in a neurobiological sense, we're still thinking way too simplistically, despite everything that you've done, Richie, and all the complex synchronization studies that you've done, Wolf. But there are other centers in the brain that we talked about that relate to different stress centers, just as there are many centers that relate to consciousness and perceiving all the sensory signals that we perceive. There are many centers in the brain that relate to these, to being able to have a focused attention. There are also many centers in the brain that intrude upon your ability to have focused attention. So Ajahn this morning talked about sitting in a cross-legged position and having your knees hurt and these intrusive thoughts that prevent you from focused attention. There's a part of the brain, deep in the brainstem, called Barrington's nucleus, which receives inputs from the viscera, from the intestines, from the stomach, from the bladder, that will intrude on your thoughts, will go then signal to the locus ceruleus, and then go and signal to the brain's stress center, the hypothalamus. And the reason is because when you have these signals from your gut, you need to act. You need to go and do something about it. You need to empty your gut, so to speak. And so that takes precedence in the body's hierarchy of what it needs to pay attention to. And so we're always receiving these signals. And I think we'll hear more from at the session tomorrow about this, but we're always receiving signals from our organs as well as from the outside world. And there's a kind of competition, a hierarchical competition between what our brains are being asked to pay attention to. And my take-home message about meditation is it is a very active process that allows you to force your brain to pay attention to something other than these other intrusive signals. And maybe your synchronization is playing a role in getting all these different centers to talk to each other.
알레디 가서 보나 류기 자와치 대하다 그래서 망구지 머시 삼로 중뭐 중기 첨비도 잡아 예시체디 이네 망구지 거라 그도리야 가서 그래 나는 밀냐가 좀 미주미아서 저디 그 머시다 로이치 치버지요 여저데 나 망구지 그 도스로 되도 거라 다른 집에는 좋아다네 직다 ben dos sanjusere jadi kursu bu kora choni yondi gorda ta andang anju gwamse da zo zo di yilu tobalo so jita pajitire 다른 집에는 검점이 류기 ben 동네 뉴르도 하생이 카오레 다고 커도 지 가져다 지 담이 류기 동네고 삼로 동조 타네 류 동네고 충을 마시네 류 동네디 일류 동네디 야지 과셔지 가리야 과셔셔지 동네디 과셔셔 좀 있나야 류기 동네고야디 셈기 지 과셔서 삼배 지 이침을 지 연구로다 사당 안주 안다 검사하지 쪼쪼 삼류 타네 다 디도 뭔고지 되게 공식 해야 되거든 그래 스폰지스 가 다 디레 다 대동는 자들 또 디리샤 류비용 다들 자리 코로코레도 다지면서 샤카에데
It's really it's a very complex issue because if you look at many of the signals that the brain receives, particularly, for example, if you need to relieve yourself, or these are very urgent body signals that the brain must receive. And here, although the attentiveness of the individual may make a difference, but generally these signals are so powerful and it happens so biologically that your response, for example, if you are hungry, the signals are so obvious. Whereas the meditation is really operating at what the Buddhists would call the mental domain. And when we talk about cultivating or refining the attention, we're really talking at the mental domain, and this is probably more related to the term adventitious suffering came up, which you refer to, the suffering that we human beings are very good at creating, the psychological suffering. So it's the meditation really relates more at that level of suffering, not so much the physical, biological pain and suffering, but more at the level of the psychological and the adventitious dukkha or suffering. And here, generally it is very difficult for a mental activity such as meditation to really completely eliminate pain at the physical level. It is possible, however, to for a meditator, as a result of deliberate or intentional mental activity, to sometimes override the physical pain, which need not necessarily be the same as actually removing the pain. Pain may be there, but because the person is in such an attentive state of mind, one could override this. But it's not the same as actually removing the pain. So meditation really seems to operate more at this level of mental domain. And when we talk about overcoming suffering, we're really talking at this psychological level, adventitious level.
Can I comment on that? So that actually fits very well with the physiology and the biology, because these pain centers, these visceral centers that receive in the brain that receive visceral signals, they're deep in the brain, and they are, as you say, almost impossible to overcome when they're calling very loudly. But higher brain centers have a top-down. There is an ability of the higher brain regions to suppress these brain centers. And so it works, the Buddhist philosophy works very well with what we know about how those brainstem regions are regulated by the higher brain regions, by the cortex and by the conscious brain. I don't know, Richie or Wolf, if you want to add to that.
로 삼을 당제 내가 지금 수부 동에 때 매번 소도요 말아. 요만 내가 고들이야. 예 갑에서 제제. 근데 제도에 된데래셔서.
I'd like to actually take this opportunity to turn to some of the questions from the audience. And there were a number of questions that were addressed to very practical issues that concern how meditation can be used to influence or to treat certain kinds of disorders, psychiatric disorders. We're going to be hearing about depression tomorrow. But a number of questions have asked about some other disorders, and I want to combine a couple of different questions. Wolf mentioned in his talk that patients with schizophrenia have a different pattern. They don't show the same kind of synchrony. This one question asker asked if we can address how meditation practice can influence PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'd like to broaden it and ask whether there are particular conditions that you believe, Your Holiness, are conditions where meditation practice may not be advisable, may be potentially harmful. And how do we best understand what those conditions might be? And in the case of post-traumatic stress disorder in particular, this person is asking whether meditation practice can help particularly survivors of war and torture and great harm.
Given the diversity of mental dispositions of people, it's very difficult to generalize that meditation would be effective. So one really has to, judge it on the basis of case by case.
지용기니 시제 상무 동조기 아니 강라 지중도 개발 시다였어요. 아다 봐봐 저기 그런 강행시랑 차이들인데 주장도 냐만도 사이언티스트 가셔 양샘지도 드라마 시 충분히 상 안다 돈 흘려줘.
Generally speaking, my own belief is that the basic outlook on life that an individual happens to have really seems to make a big difference in how you respond to traumatic experiences. And that seems to be an important factor. In fact, in one of the previous Mind and Life dialogues, there was some sense of surprise expressed on how frequent the case of post-traumatic symptoms were among the Tibetans who had undergone traumatic experiences. How infrequent?
Thank you. Maybe the whole sentence would be good.
How rare there were symptoms of post-traumatic symptoms found among Tibetans who had been exposed to trauma. I often tell the story of one of my close friends and colleague, a monk from Namgyal Monastery. He spent many years in a Chinese prison in Tibet, and when he came out, in the course of a conversation, one day he told me that during his years in prison, sometimes he had great sense of fear, and His Holiness was saying he inquired what was that fear about, he said, the fear of losing compassion towards the Chinese. So this shows that here is an individual who has quite a different outlook on life. So it seems that this kind of outlook makes a difference on how this individual is able to withstand the imprisonment and torture and so on.
Just the preventive measures that you are.
So, as in many cases, generally, it always works much better if one can prepare ahead and have some kind of preventive systems, because once you are already experienced the trauma, it's very difficult to try to correct it.
So I always stress the importance of
prevention,
the proper education from young child. So when they passing through difficult life, I think because of certain kind of mental concept or inner strength, so the external difficulties may not disturb much. That's, I think, very the tendency of Shati.
This is something we can do. This is doable. Sometimes I meet people, among those whom I know, even some that I know, often they tell me about great anxiety, sense of anxiety that they have, and if I asked what exactly...
They seek some kind of help from me, including blessing. But what is the problem? When I ask, very tiny problem, not serious, but a lot of complaints. So these are, I think, due to some kind of inner strength.
Lack of love.
In that case, I have a lot of complaints.
I have a lot of.
There was also a study, I think, in Bangladesh with the children from Buddhist communities that often subject to storms and floods, and they found a very little level of post-traumatic experience. And I think also it has to do something with the notion of, which also in the culture, of very, individualistic in the sense of being always emphasizes on the concern about what could happen to me and so forth. And when that is slightly released, in some way, there is less vulnerability and little more sense of insecurity and somehow we have the inner resources to deal with whatever may comes one's way. And so in that sense, when that happens, in fact, and then there's less sort of disturbances and trauma.
So sincerity.
In a way, sorry. In a way, that goes back to Robert's point about control. If you have a sense of control over the stresses that come upon you, whether it comes from your internal resources, which is the best place, or whether it comes from doing something, getting it out in the open, that perhaps protects against illnesses like post-traumatic stress disorder.
That's very true.
Well, let me take another question from the audience that's relevant to this theme. This person asks, do Robert Sapolsky's comments on stress-reducing environments have implications for designing healthy and healing settings? Are there any Buddhist teachings on physical environment for mindfulness and compassion?
It's only deferring the question to the two Buddhists here.
There's an enormous emphasis in Buddhism on creating community. On one occasion, it is said that the Buddha's attendant Ananda, being very impressed by the importance of community for one's own individual spiritual practice, he said, "Lord, it seems like half the practice is Sangha." And Buddha responded, "Say not so, Ananda. The Sangha, or the community, is the whole of the practice." And so I think this emphasis that we are not practicing in isolation, I mean, this strong emphasis on the ego, the self, the individual that is so strong in Western society is not an ideal in Buddhist culture, but rather cultivating environments, both in terms of human communities as well as harmonious relationship with one's general environment, are extremely important. And in that context, then, when there is threat, for example, whether it's invasion by a hostile force from outside, or whether it's a more modest threat from natural calamity and so forth, if you have the harmonious relationship with the people around you and with the general kind of, let's say, the biosphere, then you're much better prepared for dealing with stress and not falling into this post-traumatic stress disorder, but being able to actually respond with greater compassion, greater wisdom, and actually simply dealing with reality. I can speak very, very briefly, anecdotally, is that I was deeply impressed. I won't go into a big idealism here, but when I was 21, having lived in the West in a very comfortable setting, California and Europe and so on, I moved to Dharamsala in 1971, only 12 years after most of these Tibetans had arrived, so they were still very much in the refugee status. And yet I did find it was not an ideal community, it was not a utopia, so I don't want to be idealistic here, but I can say simply from my own experience that this was I would say, the most harmonious and cheerful community and warm-hearted community I'd ever encountered in my life. And it wasn't just monks, and it wasn't just saints or yogis or great teachers, but there was a sense of coming together in harmony in the community that I think must be very relevant for the rarity of post-traumatic stress disorder one finds in Tibetan community. Partly it's spiritual, but I think partly it's also cultural.
So the social environment is a Sangha as preventative medicine in some sense. Mm-hmm.
But in fact, the social environment can be either facilitated or inhibited by the built environment. And I'm actually involved now in a project with the American Institute of Architects. So I'm involved with the American Institute of Architects and the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, bringing architects and neuroscientists together to try to determine whether there are certain aspects of built space that can either trigger the stress response more or can facilitate reducing the stress response.
I think it's wonderful to do research in that way. At the same time, I'm reminded of one of my teachers who was in Tibet, an aristocrat. Very wealthy man, he had multiple estates and so forth, and then of course with the Chinese invasion, he lost everything, fled to India with his wife, and he lived in a little hut that I would say 3 men could build in one day for a cost of $100. So out of his mansions, out of his multiple estates, he lived in this little hovel, frankly. And he was the Kungobashi. He was the principal instructor of Tibetan medicine, extraordinarily erudite man. I had the privilege of receiving teachings on mind training from him. And he told me that in Tibet, where everything was going so well for him, he said he took his spiritual practice quite complacently, rather nonchalantly, because it was easy. But he said once he had lost everything, and quite a number of his family members had died, were murdered, were so forth, tremendous tragedy. He said now he found much greater peace of mind, much greater dedication to his spiritual practice. And I could sense just from him that he just exuded a sense of serenity and calm and quiet good cheer. But his environment, his architecture, was a hovel.
The concept is not that one has to build a mansion. It could be a hovel or it could be a mansion, but what are the characteristics of that physical environment that can optimize one's mood and stress response?
Where possible, it's great, but where it's not possible, where you have $100 to build your own house, then maybe more emphasis on the mind, and wherever possible, bring out the outside would be great. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Well, let me bring this back to meditation. We've been talking about ways, this is another question, that science can learn from meditation practitioners. Can you foresee a time or means when science will produce the means to enrich meditation practice? And I think that it would be useful for both the scientists as well as the contemplatives to address this question.
Yeah.
So, Wolf, would you like to go first?
Well, I think it came as a great surprise to us that there were so clear electrographic correlates of particular meditative states, which taught us something about these states. It taught us something about what the brain can do to itself through concentration. And it probably taught to the meditators, made it more explicit what they're actually doing, because we can now tell them that they are apparently focusing their attention not to peripheral sensory modalities as we all do, but that they can sort of invert their attention to read out and engage central representations at a higher level. And I think it would be interesting to see whether one cannot, by playing back, by using biofeedback techniques, since we now have a signature for certain meditative states, there may be others with other signatures, maybe find a more rapid way to learn these practices. If you have some outer criterion that helps you to find out in which state you are, because in the beginning of the training, one is, I know this from experience, very uncertain whether one is going the right way. So if one had an indicator, a meter, that would give one the measure of coherence that one has achieved in which frequency band, we know that one can, through these measures, generate brain states in a highly specific way. Let me give you an example, because I find it just amazing. This is not using EEG, but it's using functional magnetic resonance imaging. You define arbitrarily a point in your brain. Could be amygdala, could be a piece of cortex, could be a piece of thalamus, it doesn't really matter. You measure the activity in there, and you play it back to the subject, and you tell the subject, try to increase this activity. Subjects lie there and try. And they find out after a while that what they do is somehow related to what this meter does. And after a couple of sessions, they become so good that they can deliberately increase blood flow via neuronal activity in particular circumscribed regions of their brains, to the extent that they can control cursors and play ping pong with somebody lying in another scanner. Have seen those movies, it's amazing. Now, what hasn't been done so far is ask those subjects, what are you feeling when you do this? Because you would expect, if you run up your amygdala, that can't go without some emotions coming up or changes of internal states. So I think through this coupling of physiological parameters with self-reports, we could learn a lot about those states and also about the way in which the brain can control itself. And it can do it to an amazing degree.
Matthieu, and then you.
Yes, I think it's what we could learn is by meditation being exposed to various circumstances. And we say that it's very easy to meditate, as a Tibetan saying, when you are sitting in the sun with a full belly. That means everything goes fine. But so no longer than the day before yesterday, we were trying with Paul Ekman and Bob Levinson's lab in Berkeley, the startle experiment, when you got a gunshot in your ears and normally instinctive reaction is to jump, so to see different strategies that could diminish this impulsive reaction. And so we tried before, and it seems that a state called open presence, in which your mind is vast like space, and you know that the explosion is going to be felt as a sort of minimal incident, can allow you to not to jump. But still we try to change the conditions, and that has taught us something. Because by engaging in various mental states, one being to be engrossed in thoughts, to remember a story of traveling somewhere and the whole what happened. At that moment, when your mind is very sort of completely engrossed in thoughts, if that explosion occurs, that's the maximum jump. Now, in either in a calm state or in a very focused state, you are in the very clearly and vividly and without tension in the present moment. You don't need to be brought back suddenly to the present moment and you don't jump. So they're varying all kinds of states. it made us to think that probably this is due, the effect of surprise is due to be engrossed in thought and distracted and not in the present moment. So that somehow helps to refine our understanding of why the startle occurs or not. So this is trying with different types of meditation, different types of normal activities, and normally we're not exposed to that in our hermitage, but that teaches something, makes relate the effect of startle to being engrossed in one's mental construct. And there's some sort of clarifying that notion for the meditator.
See, I think another way that science can help is to basically drag the skeptics in through the back door. There is a man, a cardiologist named Meyer Friedman, who in the 1950s was the person who discovered type A personality, the relationship between a certain personality style. The link between personality style, we now realize a certain type of hostility and the threat of heart disease. And this was a man I spent a lot of time with. He was kind of a father figure. And he would always be talking about his recent patients and someone who was doing well. And he would always be saying, I'm so happy this person has become a so much nicer person, instead of saying this person has a so much healthier heart. Until one day I finally said, okay, what's the deal? Are you in the business of like preventing heart attacks, or are you in the business of saving the world? And he instantly said saving the world, and if it takes getting people to worry about their heart valves to be nicer to each other, I'm perfectly happy to do that. And I think that's what his point was. And this, by the way, was a man who had his first heart attack at age 50 and saw his last patient a week before he died at age 91. So he actually listened to what he preached.
We will take another question. This is a question that I think has been asked quite a bit, and it would be useful for, I think, both the scientists and the contemplatives to comment on it if they have an opinion. And it has to do with placebo responding and meditation. So the person who's asking this question indicates that clinical interventions are often known to exhibit a placebo effect. This individual is asking whether there's a placebo effect in meditation, and also asks whether meditation is the placebo effect.
Yeah, you see, placebo is the kind of lollipop of meditation. Kind of a lollipop to kind of a child. It's the same sort of level, but it's wonderfully, what it does is suddenly you change your attitude towards, I wish to cure, or I see the hope for curing. So it's a mind change. But it's a mind change that is a bit mechanical, because it's based upon a kind of illusion, or someone make you believe so. And so the whole difference, so we should rehabilitate the placebo, but also increase its wisdom aspect, which is to understand that precisely by transforming your mind, then that's one of the best things you could do for changing your attitude and probably the level of stress and your immune response, but not just by simply thinking that's the pill that has done it. And there's much better to do through training the mind.
So I agree. I think you said rehabilitate the placebo. The word placebo carries with it such negative connotations. It's usually followed by the word just the placebo effect. And the fact is the placebo effect is a very powerful effect, and it's not just in the mind, it is in the mind, and that's a very important effect. And I think it speaks to the point that Your Holiness made earlier, that is that these higher brain regions, these higher mental processes can, in fact, they are powerful enough to suppress those bodily intrusive feelings that we have. Not always. As you said, they don't take away pain, but they can, by sending signals down through the spinal cord, actually reduce pain. And so, yes, I think we need to think about the placebo in a different terms and to think of it as a very powerful effect. And I don't have the expertise to comment on whether meditation is the ultimate placebo, but I would suspect that the ability to focus one's attention away from pain is a very important element of placebo.
그죠, 사람들.
사람마다 로티 미국인 다들 장투요 봐. 공기 돈에 디엔자들 진짜 플라스틱 스타니 표시나 맞네. 간다 공기 돈에 내거든 여버저셔서 누가 남았나 신기. 또르래.
Well, to put it in other words, placebo is an effect of an attitude without a substance. So exactly what it is about transforming your mind. And so we should give back the letter of nobility to changing one's attitude.
Well, I think one of the crucial issues that distinguishes placebo responding from meditation is that meditation involves an element of practice. And I think that practice involves the acquisition of a skill. And while you can arrange an external circumstance to elicit a placebo response, it does not recruit the same areas of the brain that are required and that are transformed when there's actual practice. And so I think that from a neuroscientific perspective, I would expect that placebo responding would be far more fleeting than the effects of meditation, which would be more enduring.
But could it not be that there are some elements? Could it be that there are some elements of placebo and meditation that overlap? So for example, placebo involves learned expectations. It's conditioning, it's repeated learning. It's a more passive form, perhaps, than meditation, but it still involves repeated exposure to something that you expect will make you heal, or you expect will make you worse in some cases. So there is an element of learning and active thought in placebo, although we may not be aware of it.
Just out of curiosity, His Holiness is asking, does the placebo effect really extend even to more acute illnesses as well?
More acute illnesses?
Illnesses.
Severe illness.
Severe illnesses.
Well, there's controversial evidence on that. I don't think that the data are clear. There are some studies which support placebo responding for certain acute illnesses. For example, an acute asthmatic reaction can be facilitated by a placebo, and there's
acute
some
what?
good evidence.
Acute what?
An acute asthmatic.
Asthma. No.
So there's some evidence to suggest that.
Sometimes you could also have
Possible.
it is also possible that in some cases, there might be individuals who are not that sick, but believe that they are very sick, and then can experience the placebo effect.
Your Holiness, well, let me end on this one question that one of the members of the audience asked, and I think this question is best answered by you. The person asks, how can we support Americans who have gone largely numb or have become overwhelmed by constant images of violence on television, for example, in waking up so that there can be a shift in consciousness toward a more compassionate way of being? When waking up means that they will feel pain as well as potentially the bliss that comes with compassion.
His Holiness was saying that hopefully this kind of discussion can also contribute towards that goal.
I think usually people neglected about the positive things, such as compassion. They consider that's a religious matter. So those people who have not much interest about religion or faith, then they also neglected about this value. So that's why I usually try to promote I think the awareness, the usefulness about these things through the secular way.
Secular approach.
Secular approach. So I think scientific sort of finding, these are, I think, very powerful. We are not talking about God or Buddha or Bodhisattva. Simply some kind of experiment.
Evidence of the sciences.
Evidence on ordinary human being. I think that's very good. I think main purpose of our meeting, main purpose of our dialogue, now last more than 2 decades, ultimate motivation is to help, to serve humanity through the promotion of awareness. 아니 자들이 징해디 맞아 아들부터 지 구두체니 참제해야 돼 수구를 팽겨야 돼 봐. 나도 공간에서 하트 애들 넘어서네. 맞아. 코라직 나뇨. 수고 밀 참제해야 인 로고 거지 되어서. 다들 대주를 더나 야스 안 팽겨.
And one thing that would be really helpful is to try to bring to people's awareness the correlation that we have, the science, the medical science particularly, is finding between positive mental states and health, greater well-being. And for example, the one that you mentioned about this doctor, this medical scientist who experienced himself this heart attack and then later helped many other patients and also recognized the correspondence, the correlation between extreme self-centeredness and proneness to heart-related diseases. So these are very powerfully compelling evidence coming from the science, and these needs to be shared.
That person who put that question, I think more these lines. Then you will. So
once you have a better understanding of these facts, which are, have a much greater scientific evidence now and proof, then your conviction will increase in the value of these human qualities, And on the basis of the conviction, there will be a genuine aspiration to cultivate them, and then this aspiration will lead to a more joyful and happy life.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Your Holiness.
That's how it is. Thank you. Thank you.
The doors will open tomorrow at 7:30. You've already had an experience with the security, both in the beginning and at lunchtime. So I just wanted to remind you about that. Again, tomorrow afternoon, our session will start at 2 o'clock, and we'll have a special program from 2 until 3:30, and then a break, and His Holiness will come at 3:45. There's been another request. If people picked up an extra brochure, if they have multiple brochures, if you could return them to our people out there, it would be very helpful. Have a good evening.